You're listening to Risk and Resolve. And now for your hosts, Ben Connor and Todd Hufford.
Welcome back to another episode of the Risk and Resolve Pod. I'm your co-host, Ben Connor, along with Todd Hufford. And today's special guest is Bob Welch. Bob is a journalist, an author who is really a storyteller. He's an authority on narrative journalism, historic memoirs, especially World War II, and exploring themes like resilience, faith, and self-discovery. Bob is key in even part of the namesake of this podcast of Resolve. Bob was the author of the book Resolve, written about my grandfather's war story. And in fact, that's where we met Bob back in 2012. And, not to bury the lead, but there was no one better to tell the story of Clay Connor than Bob Welch. So, Bob, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks, Todd. It's great to be here.
And we'll talk about Resolve and Clay Connor in a little bit. And this is going to be aired following the release of a 7-part series of Clay Connor telling his war story through tapes. And Bob, you are the capstone of that. But before we dig into the Clay Connor story, tell us a little bit just about yourself, where you're located, how you got into journalism and that passion of yours.
Right. Okay.
Let us know what you've been up to.
All right. I live in Eugene, Oregon, out here on the left coast. Grew up an hour north of here in Corvallis. I had a 2 to true action electric football set that I used to play as a kid. And when it broke, I would create games in my mind, use my imagination, and then sit down and write a story about that game. I always wanted to be a reporter. And I went to the rival school, University of Oregon, to get a journalism degree in 1976. And I spent 40 years in newspaper journalism and then branched out and began writing books in the early 1990s. I've done a couple of dozen books. I have my own writer's workshop. I worked I taught at the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication for 20 years. So I'm a storyteller, and I've made great average sums of money doing that. And but it's been a fascinating career. I'm still involved in it. I write a weekly Substack column called Heart, Humor, and Hope right now. And getting to tell your grandfather's story was among the highlights.
I appreciate that. You had some other stories you told around World War II, and obviously that's a specialty of yours. How did it become that? How did it become a specialty?
I wrote a column. A guy came to me and told me about a World War II nurse who had died in Europe. And I wrote a column for the Register Guard here in Eugene. And a woman called me the next morning and said, "Oh, you wrote about my friend Frances Slanger. She was the first nurse to die after the landings at Normandy." I said, "Wait a minute, you knew this woman?" She said, I served with her in France." And Frances Slanger, was born in Poland, grew up in Boston, and died in Belgium. She didn't get very close to Eugene, Oregon. But here I had this connection 10 minutes from my house. Not only had this nurse served with Frances Slanger in Europe, but her husband was a doctor in the same unit. He was there the night she died. So American Nightingale was my first World War II book. And that actually set me up to get the Resolve job, I think, because my agent knew that I'd done some World War II stuff. And then I wrote a book called Healing Wounds recently about a Vietnam combat nurse, which actually was the sort of the foundational book for Kristen Hanna, who wrote a book called The Women about a Vietnam nurse, which became the best-selling book in the world last year. So anyway, that's how I got into the whole World War II thing. I'm not so interested in war. I'm interested in people. I'm interested in people with integrity and honor. And again, your grandfather certainly fit that mold.
Yeah. When you look back on just the people you wrote about, what are some lessons learned or highlights from just different people aside from my grandfather? We'll talk about him later. What are some other things that really stand out to you over your career as an author?
Yeah. I guess I'd say people, just a commitment to something bigger than themselves. Francis Langer uh, was this, showed up at Ellis Island in 1921 as a 7-year-old little girl, and she had an eye infection. So at that moment, she was separated from her mom and sister. She didn't really have a country. She left Poland and hadn't been allowed into the U.S. And she was placed in a cage, which what happened while you awaited an opinion from a doctor whether you should allow this person to come in your country. And so at that moment, I don't think anyone would have said, "Oh, Frances Langer is going to grow up and inspire thousands of people," but in fact, she did. And I think it was because she had a heart for other people, and she wrote a beautiful letter honoring the GIs, and it absolutely melted their hearts because they had no sense of purpose. This was October 44. They landed on June 6th, and they'd lost their sense of purpose and meaning and context. And this letter really inspired them. And then when they learned that a week later that she died, it broke their hearts, and they insisted something be done to honor her, and they named the first hospital ship in the Army in her honor. So, I mean, Frances Langer was a giving person. Diane Carlson Evans in Healing Wounds, a Vietnam combat nurse. Same thing, farm girl from Wisconsin and Minnesota, and just grew up, but just had this sense of service. Like, I need to enlist. Now, at the time, of course, many people my age were being drafted. I wasn't among them, but many were being drafted in the war. But she just volunteered. She said, "I need to be there. I want to be there. I want to serve my country." And that's what she did. So I guess if there's a connection, it's people who see beyond themselves and who see service to their country and to their fellow Americans as important.
Bob, the way you tell those stories just reverberates the idea that you love people and you love their stories.
Mhm.
The idea of making a career out of writing and spending, what'd you say, 40 years working for the Register Guard, or at least some kind of
Uh-huh.
print publication before you got into books. Books was kind of a little bit later in your career.
Right.
How old were you when it kind of became a realization that this could be a career I
Right.
could be employed by, and I could write for a living?
Well, I was 7 when that idea came up. I mean, I literally, my 5th grade career day, you could go hang out with a librarian or a school teacher if you wanted to be a teacher. And my teacher said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to interview Oregon State's basketball coach. I
There
want
you
to be
go.
a sports writer." And so literally, at 7, I think I wrote my first story, and that would have been like 11 years old. In 5th grade, I went and interviewed OSU's basketball coach, and I walked out of Gill Coliseum and thought, I'm going to be a reporter. I mean, so I always wanted to write. I love to tell stories, but as the decades went on, my horizons broadened. At first, it was just sports, sports, sports.
Hmm.
And then my wife and I began having kids, and I realized, if I work sports, I'm going to be working every night, every
Yep.
weekend, the rest of my life. I'm not going to see my kids anymore.
That's
So
right.
I branched into feature writing. And then in the 90s, so I would have been like about 40. That's when Harvest House, a Christian publishing house here in Eugene, offered me an opportunity to write a book. And that's when I began the book writing trend. In about 1993 was my first book, called More to Life Than Having It All, which was a book about materialism and the importance of relationships with God and others, as opposed to money and things. And didn't sell very well. In fact, after the first year, the publisher basically said they were remaindering the book, but I could buy the remaining 5,000 for just 75 cents each. And I said, "Well, what if I don't buy them? What happens to those books?" And he said, "Well, we have them recycled." And I said, "What, into what? Like paper towels and Kleenexes?" And I said, "No, no, no." And he said, "Yeah, toilet paper." I said, "My book could be turned into toilet paper?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "When I wrote that book, I remember thinking, I want to write a book that touches people's lives in a special place. Not the place I had in mind, but at any rate, a lot of ups and downs as an author over the years, but I wouldn't have traded the profession for anything."
Yeah, I've got a great appreciation for those with innate talent. Earlier this year, we were able to interview Brett Varvel, and he's got a great talent for movie making
Mhm.
and go to any concert in the musicianship. Great talent. I think about writing, and it sometimes doesn't get the same the same weight that people think about as
Mhm.
other outward talents, whether it's singing or musicianship.
Right.
But let me tell you, there's just as much God-given talent that's bestowed at birth, as well as work and effort it takes to
Right.
hone that craft.
Right.
You realized pretty early you had an interest.
Mhm.
Did you have any reason to think you had any ability when back when you were pretty young?
I do. I think I think the best thing I was bestowed with by my parents was just an imagination, interested in, somebody would walk by, she'd want to engage them. So I think I learned to be, to appreciate other people through her. And my father was a fly fisherman, loved to drive up into the high Cascades and hike into his lakes and fish. So he had a sense of adventure. And I think between curiosity and adventure, you develop an interest in the world, and you're always asking questions. Why? And it's served me well my whole year, because when you sit down with a source, you know that, Frances Slanger wrote this beautiful letter, and then she died. But then you have to answer all these whys. Who was Frances Slanger? Why, when she came to America and was dirt poor, why was she somebody who thought that she said the world, there's the haves and the have-nots, and I don't know how I was so blessed to be one of the haves. I mean, they never owned a house. They never owned a car. In our perspective, in my perspective, I wouldn't think that Frances Langer was a have, but she saw herself as one. So I think that just developing that, always looking at the world and wondering about things, and then trying to say, could I be the person that answers those questions? And that's what really storytelling is all about, is you're answering questions, and taking these lives and holding a spotlight. I love to hold a spotlight on people who don't want the spotlight, but who deserve it. And Francis Slanger, your father, Diane Carlson Evans, these are all people who deserve that spotlight, whose stories need to be told.
Do you find that during the writing process, you're more gifted in what you were kind of explaining, that digging, the shining of the light on a person, or do you find your gifting is more in the words? Once you have the research and the knowledge, you're more gifted in those words come kind of out of your mind through the pen, through the keyboard
Yeah.
more easily. Where's your strength? And where do you stumble in the writing process?
I think you need both. I think you need, again, that innate interest in the person, and then you have to have obviously some sort of skill enabled to tell that. I was blessed in the '90s to um, um, be under the tutelage of a guy named John Franklin, who wrote a book called Writing for Story. He was a Pulitzer Prize winning author, from the writer for the Baltimore Sun, and he came out here and worked at the U of O School of Journalism. He kind of taught me how to tell a story in journalism and newspaper. You talk about the inverted pyramid, where you tell the most important thing first, and then the less important thing, and then at the bottom of the pyramid, the least important thing. That is in the old days, because if they wanted to cut your story at the bottom, they could cut it, and the least important thing would get cut.
Oh, interesting.
But Franklin told me about keeping secrets. Franklin taught me about foreshadowing, about surprise. Clay Connor, is one of 7 people who are going to avoid the Bataan Death March and see if they can survive in the jungle of Luzon by themselves. Can he do it?
Hmm.
And so, in newspaper journalism, the headline would be, Connor survives, survives 3 years in the Philippines or something. But in storytelling, I'm not going to tell you that. I'm going to put the breadcrumbs on the trail. I want you to come along for the journey and get to know Clay Connor and find out what happens to him. And it's rarely a straight, easy trek from here to there. And in your grandfather's story, it certainly was not all over the place. And with Francis Slanger and Diane Carlson Evans, most stories are like hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, which I've done. You're just all over the place, up and down, left and right. You get lost. And finally, there's this conclusion and this inspiration. I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I even answered your question, Todd, but
You know
that's
what?
great.
It was
fun
you told a
writing.
great story. Good job.
It was great. How has journalism changed over time? Obviously, we're very much in the digital age now. What does that journey look like? as technology's changed, or is it kind of the same?
Oh, no, it blows my mind as I think about I'm now writing for a digital newspaper, just a one column or two columns a month for a new digital newspaper in Eugene. Our newspaper, the Register Guard, which is one of the best mid-sized dailies in the country, basically died because it was bought out by a chain, and they had no interest in maintaining it as a journalistic institute. They wanted to just make money off it. So this is what's happening so much in the last 20 years in America with the death of so many newspapers. And so, the changes of technologically that, I started out literally in 1976 typing on a typewriter at the first newspaper, and then went to uh, computers. And then we got into the social media age. Now I report to a boss who's half my age. And the technology is totally different. I think what we've lost is a sense of honesty and truth, and so many people on the left and the right, everybody's trying to sort of promote their point of view, and I think what's kind of got lost in that is any sort of sense of objective truth. And I mean, we used to do an assignment. I would have I had a former student come in and burst into one of my classes at the University of Oregon, and make a commotion. And then I'd sort of have to kick him out of the room. And then I'd say, okay, you have 1 hour. I want you to write your story. What just happened? And I would get 16 different versions of the truth. And I understand that it's hard to find an objective truth in journalism, but we've gotten so far away from that now that I think it's a dangerous time in America. And I think that the truth has kind of gotten blown away in the wind in many ways. So I'm less concerned about the technological changes as I am about the accuracy, the fairness changes. I mean, when I started in this business, I mean, a professor would say, if you make a fact error in a story, every error you make drops your grade by 1. And if you misspell somebody's name, you simply flunk the assignment. There was a standard that you would adhere to. And now anyone just sort of gets online and says, oh, I'm a journalist. And they might not have any training. They might not have any ethics. And yet they get out there and start telling you this is what's going on in the world. Maybe it is, but maybe, and most probably it's not, because you've got an axe to grind and you're not really seeking the truth. You're seeking to promote, your left or right, getting the ball across the goal line. So that's my bigger concern.
Yeah, it's kind of a dangerous future of, the lack of objective truth.
Yeah.
And I guess to your point, there is vantage points, right? Different
Yeah.
vantage points, but
Yeah.
a lack of objective truths, then you get in the world of propaganda, and it's all about the money or
Yep.
whatever else is the motivation.
Yeah. And
Um,
I've enjoyed not getting into the political fray much. I've enjoyed I'm more interested in telling people stories and inspiring someone. I can't control the world, and I learned that long ago, but I can write something that 20 years later I get an email. I just retired as a nurse, and I want you to know I became a nurse because I read American Nightingale. I was so inspired by Francis
Wow.
Slang or something like that. To me, that's the kickback. That's the joy of writing, is that you can change the world, inspire people in big ways and small ways.
Before we get transition into talking about resolve and talking about how things have changed over time, um, and this is a little bit off the beaten path, but could you have ever imagined that the University of Oregon would have ended up in the Big Ten?
No. And I wish that they hadn't. Nothing against the Big Ten at all.
Yeah.
It's an amazing conference, and it's an honor to be part of it. But I guess I'm a regionalist at heart. I believe there's some. I sail last night. I was sailing with a friend of mine who was a geography professor at the University of Oregon, and he was saying where we live, where we're located, really matters to us, and somehow trying to get used to the Big Ten has just been really hard for those of us out here in the West, because we had this West Coast conference, and and we were kind of like this family. And suddenly, you know, you're playing a baseball game against Maryland at 8 a.m. our time on a Sunday morning. It's like, it's hard. It's been hard to kind of figure out who's who. And we like our rivalries. You know, we like
Yeah.
Oregon State, the Oregon and Oregon and Washington. Suddenly that's kind of diluted. Again, privileged to be part of the Big Ten, but if I could change the hands of time, I would go back and stay and keep the Pac-12 together. But,
Yeah. Like we just
and
talked about it.
don't even get me going about what it was like to sit at the Rose Bowl and get throttled by Ohio State. Yeah, but anyway,
Yeah.
that was
Well,
maybe the worst day of my life. That Oregon just never showed up. But
money has changed things, and that's
it really
certainly
has, and it just, I mean, in the last 10 years, so many changes in our, politically and then athletically. Gosh, between the NIL and conference changes, the transfer portal, like my son, I got a 45-year-old son, and he just doesn't go to Oregon basketball game. He goes, Dad, I don't know any of these guys. They're here for 1 year, maybe 2. They come and go.
True.
It used to be, you'd follow a kid from his freshman year to his senior year. And again, those were the old days. But I do kind of miss some of that cohesiveness within conferences and within the universities that we used to have that now seems scattered in the wind.
Yeah.
Bob, you
Well,
mentioned
I was at the Big Ten tournament for basketball, trying to cheer on my Indiana Hoosiers, and we just got bounced out immediately by your Ducks, and that was just a pain to watch.
I'm
But
sure it was. But
well,
yeah,
as
I
we
still love once they throw the ball up in the air for basketball or kickoff and football. I still love the game itself. I'm
Yeah.
a season ticket holder. I live exactly 1 mile from here to Autzen Stadium where we play football. We walk to games. I still love the game. I just don't love all of the money and the lack of loyalty. Going back to loyalty, we were talking about journalism and the truth and stuff. And now you got, there used to be a kid would commit to Indiana and like, I'm gonna be a Hoosier for 4 years. And now it's like, well, I didn't like my coach that much, so I'm going to transfer. Well, I didn't like my situation here, I'm going to transfer. And so the loyalty among coaches, players, it's a crazy world. So
crazy world. Well, as we kind of transition, talk about resolve, I think to get this conversation kicked off, love to just get your vantage point of how Clay Connor's story got to you,
right.
and what was the process like to learn about Clay Connor?
Yeah. Well, working on resolve and working with your fathers and uncles was a joy. I believe that they had another author who wasn't working out, and so somehow they got in contact with my agent, who contacted me. Would you want to do this? And I immediately gravitated to the story, because what was interesting about Clay Connor was, in storytelling terms, he had no business surviving like he did. He was a guy who had never camped out a single night. He was a golfer at Duke. He was a cheerleader at Duke. He had hardly fired a gun. And suddenly he's in the jungle of Luzon, and he's got to not only, he has to ingratiate himself with 6 strangers, U.S. soldiers that he doesn't know. He has to avoid the Japanese army. He has to avoid snakes and disease. I mean, and elevation changes that make my hike on the Pacific Crest Trail look like a walk in the park. I mean, there was just no reason why he should have survived what he did. And so in storytelling terms, that was great. But the third question was then, okay, so how difficult or easy will this book be to write? And I remember talking to one of Ben, I think it was your father, and I said, well, how much information do you have? And I remember he said, well, are you at your computer? And I said, well, yeah, I am. And he said, well, I'm going to send you a couple of files. And so we're on the phone, and all of a sudden these files start showing up on my screen, and I'm looking at them, and I mean, this is like, I just walked into a 5-star restaurant, and they brought me every one of their finest courses right in front of me and said, here, eat. And so, whereas American Nightingale, I worked for 4 years on that book, and all I knew was Slanger wrote this beautiful letter. She was killed that night. They named a hospital ship in her honor. This was the Resolve was just the opposite. It was just like, oh my gosh, not only is this a great story, and these seem like good people to work with, but here's all this information because your grandfather had kept copious notes, and as I recall, had stuffed them into bamboo, like 4 or 5 inch thick bamboo stalks, and then had friends in the Philippines save them and then send them home to him, his journal, after the war. So he kept these notes and these journals and letters, the letters that your grandmother was or your no, I guess it would be your great grandmother.
Right.
Where's my son Clay? Is he okay? All of these letters were provided to me, which made a great start to every chapter as we updated this mother's, absolute desperation to find out what happened to her son. Is he alive? It was the perfect storm of easy writing. I mean, easy compared to a lot of writing, and it was just a privilege to do it.
At some level, does there become too much information in a story like Claire?
That is a definite problem. I think I had 32 notebooks of hard copy information on American Nightingale, and I think I'm sure there were dozens and dozens of files that were sent me for Resolve. So yeah, part of it is, like I said, I just got through writing a book about writing called Writer, and part of it is like wrestling a dinosaur. It's like, yeah, you have this great opportunity, but like, okay, where do I even start? Because you do have this just this so much information, and you have to always keep reminding, okay, so what's the story, what's important and what's not. But a lot of at the start, the biggest part is to sort of decide what is not part of the story. Like a friend of mine, Jane Kirkpatrick, she's a historic fiction writer. She says, if you want to sculpt an elephant, you take a block of stone and you chip away everything that isn't the elephant, and then you get your elephant. And in the same way with Resolve, I had to do the same thing. I had to chip away everything that really wasn't Clay Connor's story. And but really having all that information was way more advantage than detriment. Let's put it that way.
I remember when you came out to Indianapolis and the guys laid everything out on the big round table in our conference room, and it was everything from photographs to his handwritings
to his pistol.
Yeah, to the pistol, to the American Bible Society New Testament,
right,
to the letters you referenced that his mother, Ben's grandmother, wrote to the State Department at the time, to the 3 different 3-ring binders that he had kind of taken and basically written his memoir. I mean, he was a scrapbooker before scrapbooking was popular.
Oh, definitely.
And I remember you kind of looking at it, of course, not knowing you, and you just said, well, this is the most well-documented book that never existed that was. And
I don't remember saying that, but I'm sure that I did. I was blown away, and I wasn't used to that kind of organization. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's a bit of a family trait. I mean, starting with your grandfather and obviously passed down to your father and uncles. And I was the beneficiary of that. So it was I think we wrote the story fairly fast because I didn't have to, with American Nightingale, I spent pretty much, I went back to the Northeast twice. I flew to France. I was in Normandy, France on 9/11 of all days, trying to follow the steps of Francis Slanger there. Whereas your grandfather had documented his journey, his adventure so well that I didn't need to do any of that. So I believe I had a rough draft done of this book probably within 6 to 9 months. Whereas, again, there was a 4-year process for American Nightingale.
Well, you also mentioned how in a classroom setting, you created a situation and asked the students to then write about what they observed.
Right.
I also remember kind of tangentially watching you interview all 4 brothers, and that was exactly the same thing. They all grew up in the same household with the same parents, hearing the same stories, having the same occurrences, but I'm sure you heard a similar story told from a different vantage point. they were separated in
Somebody
age by.
once said, even though we grow up in the same family, we all have different parents.
That's true.
Okay, and I think there's a truth to that because I'm kind of a little bit of an expert on memoir writing as well, and I've seen this happen many times where, like, if my sister and I sat down to talk about what our childhoods were like, we had two different childhoods. They would say, "Well, mom and dad were like this," and
No, they
Linda,
weren't.
she might say, "No, they were like this," and both of us are right. And so, yeah, I think each of the four sons had a little bit different perspective, but I would say for the most part they were fairly aligned in their respect, in their seeing their father for who he was, for seeing his attributes, for seeing some of his weaknesses. For the most part, they were aligned, and that made my job pretty simple. I didn't have anybody calling me, later after meeting, say, "Well, he said this, but it's really like that,"
Yeah.
or whatever like that. So it was never. It was a smooth process, and an invigorating process because they were as excited about this story coming out as I was as a writer, and I felt a great sense of team play. We were all on the same page. I had their support. I think they felt that I was doing the right thing, and so it was a pleasure to be part of it.
Well, it's been over 10 years now.
Oh, I can't
Think back.
even believe
I
that.
know. Think back. Were there some surprises along the way, either in digging through the information or just surprises in maybe how you chose to convey the story?
Hmm. The only surprise that I could that was just your grandfather's late in life and some of the decisions that he made late in life. That uh, that was a surprise to me because it didn't seem to fit the character of the man that I was writing about. But I also have interviewed thousands of people, and I know that people are complex, and um, so people make decisions for lots of different reasons. But anyway, that was probably the biggest surprise to me. But the story as it was unfolding, I guess I was surprised. I had no idea that he went through as much difficulty as he did to survive. I mean, you think of Swiss Family Robinson. Somebody said that this book was like Unbroken meets Swiss Family Robinson, and I kind of like that. And if anyone who's read or seen the movie Unbroken knows what those soldiers who were part of the Japanese prison camps, what they went through. But your father. Um, I just think it's incredible that he survived, partly because even if he had been equipped to handle it, but mainly because he was so unequipped to handle it, and how at one point he had no support of his own men. They didn't respect him, and I think that his is a great story of somebody not talking themselves into a sense of respect, but showing, just doing the thing and earning the honor of the men around him. And so he wound up being this leader, putting this ragtag group of Pygmy Negritos and other Filipinos together in this little army that clearly he was the dude, he was the guy, he was the man that these people were going to follow. And so the nowhere to somewhere swath of Clay Connor was probably the biggest surprise. And again, from storytelling standpoint, it was awesome.
Um, what there's a lot of different moments in that where you're like, man, I can't believe that he navigated that situation
Right.
or circumstance.
Yeah.
What particularly struck you? Were there any particular stories or moments where you're like,
It,
I just can't believe this?
it was Ben, it was like one after another. I mean, it was just this rolling wave of that happening. But the one that strikes me most was when he dared to go into this village and he told his buddies who had pretty much given up hope. And Clay was the one that kept that group together. He was the one that kept saying, "We can do this, but we can't do it alone. We have to ingratiate ourselves to this Pygmy Negrito tribe. they're our salvation. They know how to protect themselves from the Japanese, and we need to lock arms with them. So I try to imagine myself at age 22 or 3, I think, when I was, maybe just graduating from the U. Here's how cowardly I was. Spring vacation of my senior year, my wife and I got married before my senior year. We drove up to Seattle ostensibly to look for a job in a newspaper. I was so fearful. All I did in the entire week was walk into the Olympian in Olympia, Washington, and buy a newspaper. And then we came home from spring break, and okay. So that's what a weakling I was. Your grandfather walks into a Pygmy Negrito village. He's white. He's an American. They're black. They're Pygmy Negritos. They know the land. He doesn't know the land. They know the customs. He doesn't know and he basically says, hey, I'm Clay Connor. I'm part of this ragtag outfit. Why don't we work together? We can help each other out. We can teach you some things that will help you, and you can teach us some things that will help us. I mean, who does that? That to me was the moment of courage. And really, I think that was what we in writing we would call the point of insight. That's where everything changed. Because for some strange reason, this king, whose name escapes me right now, he liked your grandfather. He thought he was a cool dude. And your grandfather had grown up on Western movies, and he had this little sense of John Wayne in him that he'd seen from the screen, and he played it out in how he treated other people. He treated people with great respect, but he was also just cocky enough, just confident enough to win over this king who really didn't need this little ragtag group of Americans as much as they needed his tribe. So that was the moment for me.
That's awesome. Yeah, there's so many things that occurred, and I totally agree that was the moment that changed it all, and really the audacity. There seems to be so many.
That's a great word, Ben. It was the audacity to do it in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, so many moments where it was really pushing your chips all in.
Yeah, and the other thing was he was eloquent. He not only was a swashbuckler, and where that came from for a guy who really, in the last year had been disrespected by his own men because they didn't think he was tough enough. Again, the cheerleader, golf background. I mean, come on, he wasn't a wrestler or something. He also was eloquent, and he wrote very well, and he spoke very well, and he touched these people's hearts. I mean, if you want to change people, you've got to get to the heart. And I think that's what I appreciate about Clay was that he did that. And so anyway, what an amazing story. I someday before I die, I would love to see the movie version of this. And I know we came close right before COVID, and then it kind of blew away. But anyway, I still have
talk a little bit about that, Bob. What was seemingly in the works right before COVID, and what's your hopes and dreams about a movie?
Well, all I know is that I was talking to somebody who really showed me great respect. I mean, I've been approached for my books probably a half a dozen to a dozen times from people, the Wizard of Foz, the guy who invented the Fosbury flop high jump style. I have lots of people who come to me and they say they want to do a movie about it, but they really like the idea of it. They're not really committed to doing it. But in Resolve's case, right before COVID, it was going to happen. I believe that who was the guy that had signed on as the executive producer? You guys know?
I don't recall.
God, his brother used to play on Blue Bloods. I don't know.
Oh, you mean the Wahlberg?
Yeah. One of Wahlberg's older brother, his brother, as I recall, was going to be the executive director of this movie. It was going to be filmed in either Hawaii or the Philippines. I'd seen the contract. I'd done everything but sign the contract, and I was pretty excited about the whole thing Yeah, and then COVID hit, and somehow people
Everything
went their
stopped.
different directions during COVID, and I don't think they could get the band back together, as it were, after COVID. So anyway, I'd still love to see that happen. I know that you guys have made every phone call, sent every text message you can to whoever you can, and but we just you got to keep working away. And if you want any inspiration, Clay Connor is a great one, because
He is.
there was no reason he should have been alive after 3 years in those jungles, but he somehow was. And so hopefully we can just keep working away and something will happen.
So you mentioned, I'm gonna circle back to, you talked about the surprise and just the more or less the decisions at the end of his life. I think I've had at least a dozen comments of, because that's included at the end of the book. And I think that surprised a lot of people of like, well, why and how did that get in there?
Mhm.
So if you could kind of share, because there had to have been a conversation of, there's this war story, but it's about this man. And what was the conversation like with maybe even my dad and my uncles and you about why or how or what, what's the story about that being included at the end?
I think that I think that when we sat down to talk about the story to begin with, we said we just need to be honest. We just if you're going to tell somebody's life story, their memoir, you can't say, well, let's tell this part, but let's not tell the other part. I mean, we're all complex, and we all do good things, and we do some not so good things. And with your grandfather, at the end of his toward the end of his life, he left your grandmother and took up with someone else. And again, that seemed inconsistent to me as a writer with the Clay Connor that I'd come to know through the story. But again, I don't know what his life was like that. I hate to just sort of say, oh, I'm not going to let that sort of taint everything that he did that was so positive. It was kind of a clank. It was kind of a like, whoa, wait, where did this come from? But I think that when you tell the full truth like that, the reader is more willing to realize that the other stuff that you told about the person that was really positive, that really is true. That
Right.
that we're not just shining you on. We didn't just create this story. It's not a piece of fiction. This is who the man was. He was a man of great integrity, of great honesty, of great perseverance. And then at the end of his life, there was a quirky decision, I think, that he made. And so I try to look at the people that I write about in the full terms and realize that myself. I've got skeletons in my closet. In college I cheated on a test. And that I've never told that story until 5 seconds ago. But anyway, I can't even believe that I did it. I did it, and someday I'm going to tell that story. But I would hate for someone to say, "Oh, then you're a bad person." I don't want to read your book about writing or about hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, or I don't trust anything you wrote because you did that. So we all are complex, and I think you have to look at the person as a whole, as an entity, as opposed to just like this or this or this.
Yeah. I mean, I look at it a couple of ways of, one, it highlights really in a maybe not so subtle way that uh, we all have a need for a savior.
Yeah.
No matter someone's integrity level, we all have made
Right.
decisions that
Right.
put us in that position. And
Yeah.
two,
Sort of
no
kind of
matter,
the Romans 3:23 world. We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and
100%.
yeah.
And also just no matter how disciplined someone is, or the path, the pathway of integrity that you've laid, like you have to be on guard all the time,
Right. Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
or things can happen. So no, I think that's one thing that's interesting as a family member for that part of the book. And as you mentioned, my grandfather leaving my grandmother for another woman, that being in the book. It was interesting to read that, but it's also, it's part of who he was,
Yeah.
and it was
Yeah.
part of our family story, and
Yeah.
it's something to learn from, and also in a weird way be encouraged from, of like, no, like this is really important, and these things do affect people, and all decisions, good and bad. So
Yeah. Yeah.
very interesting. Um, well, Bob, again, I can't think of anyone that could have been a better choice to write about my grandfather and tell that story. You did it so perfectly, and our family is truly grateful for
Oh,
that.
well,
And
as I said, Ben, it was a privilege, and you know, I have a habit when I go speak somewhere, I fly somewhere. I always I read my own books on the plane, my old books. It's just like, I spent a lot of time on that, and I don't want to just put it on the shelf and and never revisit. So recently I was flying, I believe, to San Antonio to speak to some military nurses, and I read Resolve. And I don't say this egotistically, but I mean, as I'm reading, I'm just going, this is a really good book. And again,
mhm,
not because I wrote it, but because your grandfather lived it. And and again, I so can see it as a movie, because it's there's so much action. Some of it's physical, and some of it's simply your grandfather's perseverance, his unwillingness to quit, and his staying focused on the things that mattered. Bringing home. What kind of story is this? I mean, like, he goes through all this, and he never forgets the Filipinos who helped him. And one of the Filipinos who helped him comes back and winds up working what for the city, like a state police dude in Indiana. Your dad
yep,
or your grandfather gets him a job. He's like this high position in the Indiana State Police. I mean, who does that? I mean, that's the Clay Connor that I remember, and that's the Clay Connor that inspires me. And so his story has so much dimension, and there's so much schlock on the big screen these days. Stories we've seen over and over, and war stories that are really nothing about this group of guys killing this group of guys, to be honest. And your grandfather's story has so much dimension um, and integrity that I do hope that I have to wave to my neighbor lady walking by. I do hope that it becomes a movie someday.
yeah,
And I'm going to double my prayers to that effort.
Absolutely. Think about this, Bob. That the whole war experience occurred in the 40s. It kind of worked its way out with Clay during his lifetime. He passed away in the early 80s.
Oh my God.
The book
I
gets
know. And it's that we're in the 20s now. It's like we're
the book
coming up
gets
on
written.
we're actually starting to think about maybe the 100-year anniversary of World War
That's,
II.
that's right.
Crazy guy. We've got past 80, and so it's amazing how time passes. But good stories live on, and I do hope that your grandfather's does. So
Well, think about this. Then the book gets written in early 2010s.
right.
And let me ask you this question: do you think Bob Welch would have been prepared to write Resolve in 1992?
No way.
No
No
way.
way. I mean,
Okay, so
I think that God sort of takes us through and gives us the tools that we can get something done with, and then he gives us more sophisticated tools down the road. But
right.
um, again, I've always, to be honest with you, American Nightingale, we literally, my sons and I put together a DVD because we could. Simon and Schuster basically said, "Yeah, you're on your own for publicity." Great. I worked for 4 years on this project. So anyway, my sons and I put together a DVD on Francis Langer, and we sent 200 out, and one entity responded.
Wow.
One, but it was Good Morning America. So we got on Good Morning America. That's the good news. And the bad news is that Ronald Reagan died the same week, and then sucked all the air out of the Good Morning America episode we were on. So we only appeared on the East Coast. So long story short, American Nightingale never got any traction, and it never sold all that well. And I've always lamented, I always thought that was a story that deserved to be on the big screen, and it deserved to be a best-selling book. Again, not because I wrote it, because Francis Slanger lived it. But at any rate, if I hadn't have gone through that process, my agent wouldn't have known that I had the chops to write Resolve, and he never even would have approached me about it.
That's right.
So, why do things happen for a reason? That's why I wrote it. So good question, Todd. And you're right. You kind of have to go through these trials, I think, to get to another level.
Took 65 years for the book to be written. I hope it doesn't take 65 years for the movie. Obviously, we're all waiting and praying for the right director, the right producers, the right actors. I think something that might be happening in the God's economy is that we know that movies they're harder to be profitable these days. There's less eyeballs. It's more fragmented, more fractured.
Right.
But we also have technology increasing that allows us to make movies that are even better produced at a lower cost.
Right.
So my hope is that those two lines are crossing here in the near future.
Yeah.
Because I want to be like you do around when that movie's made.
Right.
It will be made.
Yeah.
I just want to be around when it's made.
All right, and we'll have a big reunion celebration in Indianapolis. Meanwhile, you're both welcome to come out to Eugene the next time Indiana plays the Ducks.
Yeah,
I think maybe we play Indiana maybe at home this year, maybe in Eugene.
Anyway, we might have to make a trip out there.
I just this morning drove by they're putting in a brand new, the Phil Knight Nike money. They're putting in a new indoor practice facility at Oregon. That's supposed to be kind of state of the art. I mean, it looks like a giant spaceship, but I don't even know where they're going to practice this year, because all their fields there's no way it's going to be ready in another 2 weeks or a month for fall ball. But anyway, if you're always welcome to come out here to Eugene and watch your Hoosiers. And I like the Hoosiers, actually. I mean, partly because of my connection to you and your family. Oh, and the other cool thing was, I think, Ben, it was your dad. I had a day off when I was back there, and I said, how close is that gym that they filmed Hoosiers at? And he goes, oh, it's only about 90 minutes from Indianapolis. And are you kidding me? So I got a rental car, and I got to go, and I show up on like a Sunday morning, and a neighbor comes over. I'm like looking in there, it's all locked up. A neighbor comes over. Oh, I got the key. You want to see it? And I literally get to go in the gym that was filmed in the movie Hoosiers and shoot baskets. Anyway, it was a great time to be back there with you and your family, and I wish you guys all well.
Appreciate that, Bob. And we usually end our episodes with 2 questions for our guests. So wanted to ask you the first question. What is a risk that you have taken that has changed your life?
Hiking the Pacific Crest Trail comes to mind. I did that over an 11-year period, starting in 2011. My brother-in-law, finished it in 22, and I leave next week for the High Sierra. So that's changed my life in the sense that I think it's given me confidence to do things I never thought that I could. And I think you can apply that to your writing, or, being a grandparent, or whatever your thing. So, that was a huge risk. And
share a little bit about that, Bob. You, what is that? What's that hike like? And, and of course you're an author, so you wrote about it, right?
Yeah. My book is 7 Summers and a Few Bummers. It was going to happen in 7 years. We finally did it in 11 after COVID and family members dying, not on the trail, but while we were hiking, after fires, lots of fires on the trail. So the trail goes from Mexico along the High Sierra of California and the High Cascades of Oregon and Washington to the Canadian border. It's the equivalent of elevation, is the equivalent of hiking to the top from sea level to Mount Everest and down 16 times.
Oh my gosh.
It's very twisting and turning, and you're going about 20 miles a day. You're all of your food and water, is on your back. Well, not all your water, because you stop and get that in springs and rivers and such, but it's quite an adventure. And, my brother-in-law is going to he's 73. I'm now 71. And we're always the oldest people out there, but it's fun to hobnob with the young ones, as we call them. And, the beauty, God's beauty is everywhere, but like the High Sierra, you're almost always above 8,000 to 10,000 feet. and above the tree line, and you go as high as Mount Whitney, which is 14,505. It's the highest point in the lower 48 states. We'll hopefully on August 12th we'll be on the top of that to see the sunrise. So it's increased. It's made me appreciate all the more the amazing sculpting of our world, of this earth by God, and it's taught me in the same way that I think Clay Connor probably got a lot of confidence from what he went through, that even though when you don't think you can do something, if you can. And so that's probably the biggest risk I can think of.
2,653 miles is what the internet says that is.
Yeah.
And you've completed how many of those miles, you think?
How many have I completed?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I've done the whole thing.
The whole thing.
Yeah. So we did it in 17 different sections because my brother-in-law is a doctor. We couldn't, the young ones will start in April and they'll do it in 4 to 5 months. They'll
Like
hike
the
the
Appalachian
whole
Trail.
thing in one summer, and hopefully before the snow flies in the North Cascades by the Canadian border. Glenn and I, because we had jobs, we did it in 17 different sections, and I think the most was maybe 350 miles, and the least was 20 miles. My brother-in-law got heat stroke in the desert of California, so we only lasted one day down there. And I came close to hypothermia high in the high Sierra of California. So lots of adventure, but I wouldn't trade the experience for anything. So
what was the longest number of days you were out?
Great question. And I think 23 was our longest trip. And I think that included one shower.
Oh,
So you can imagine what you look like. I mean, you have your food mailed ahead in most cases to like fishing lodges or grocery stores along the way, sometimes a post office. You pick it up that way. I mean, we sent our food for this trip that we're leaving on August 1st. We had to send the food 10 days ago. So you can imagine it's going to be almost a month. But
wow.
when we open that 5-pound bucket at this little Muir Trail Ranch along the way, it's going to have been in there about a month. All of our Snickers bars and our freeze-dried meals and such. It's not gourmet eating on the Pacific Crest Trail.
It's just calorie intake is all it
Yep,
is.
you use about 5,000 a day to go about 18 to 20 miles, and you have to replenish that somehow. So you eat a lot of junky stuff.
Do you ever find berries along the way?
Oh yeah, the berries are best in northern Washington, huckleberries in particular, and you learn to just how to hike and just sort of grab them with your hands without stopping, because you're always, you got to keep your eyes focused on Canada. So.
Oh my gosh. Well, Bob, the second question we'd like to ask people is, what is left yet unfinished that you, my friend, have the resolve to yet complete?
Wow, that's a great question. I want to write a novel. I've written over 2 dozen books and helped people write maybe another dozen. They're all true stories, except for my Keyboard Kitten series for kids. But I'm right now. I've just finished a book called Writer that's coming out in September, and it's just about my 40 to 50 years of experience as a writer, what I've learned from it, and how I can help others write. So I'm excited about that. It's ahead of schedule, and I think it's a pretty good book. But then I've always told true stories, and suddenly to make up a story, I'm having a hard time getting my mind to allow myself to lie. And all my novelist friends said, "You're not lying. You're telling a true story. You're just imagining it." So that's the thing that the thing on my bucket list would be to do that. I'd love to watch one round of the Masters at Augusta. But I don't have a long bucket list. I've had a pretty blessed life between the people I've met at riding, between a great family. Our 2 sons live here in Eugene, and we have 5 grandkids within 10 minutes of us. We watch a lot of baseball and football games. So we have a beach cabin on the Oregon coast, 90 minutes away from here. So anyway, I don't have a lot of unfinished business, but the novel would probably come to mind.
That's a good lesson for everybody.
Yeah.
Get past all the stuff and leave not a lot of unfinished business. I like
There
that.
you go.
Well,
Well,
Bob,
thank you.
thanks for joining us, and thanks for our listeners. This ends another episode of the Risk and Resolve Pod. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.